Welcome back to Dreaming Against the Machine. I'm your host, Adam Becker, and this week's episode is a little bit different. And to be perfectly honest, it's because I was a little bit intimidated by our guest. Not because he's an intimidating guy, far from it. He's actually an incredibly kind guy who has been particularly nice to me, but he's also a legend. This week's guest is Kim Stanley Robinson. He's the author of the Mars trilogy, The Ministry for the Future, The Years of Rice and Salt, Aurora, and so many other great books. He is one of the living masters of science fiction. And I've been reading science fiction my entire life since I was a little kid. I didn't actually get into Stan's work until I was an adult, but I knew about it all along, and I certainly knew he was a big deal. But as I said, he's also just a really nice guy, and he's thought really deeply about what it would take to build a better future. So, here's Kim Stanley Robinson. I am incredibly pleased to have as my guest the acclaimed author, Kim Stanley Robinson. Stan, welcome to Dreaming Against the Machine.
Thanks, Adam. It's good to be with you.
Stan, I want to start by asking you a question that we already sort of discussed over email a bit. This is a big question, and I think in a way we're going to end up talking about it the whole time, one way or another. But what is the role of science fiction in envisioning the future? Le Guin said that it's not about that, but also obviously people have taken inspiration from science fiction.
Well, I loved Le Guin very much, who was a teacher and friend, but I don't think she's right about that. And I've had to think about it a lot being a science fiction writer. And what she's pointing out is one part of a double action. So the analogy that I was using back when there were 3D movies was science fiction is like the glasses that you put on to see a 3D movie in 3D. It has two actions with two different functions, and by seeing through both of the lenses, which show you slightly different things, then a third dimension pops. So on the one hand, what Le Guin was pointing out is that science fiction is really always a way of talking about the present or even the past.
Mm-hmm.
Every moment, especially in modern history, has a strong sense of potentiality, of futurity, of what's coming next, of a trajectory into some kind of future. And that feeling changes as the present changes and forestalls or cuts off certain things that seemed possible before and brings new opportunities and possibilities into play. So that the guy who wrote the science fiction encyclopedia, John Clute, a rather magnificent and awesome achievement, he said that he could read any science fiction novel and date it to within a year or two of its date of publication because of the assumptions that novel was making. And I believe he could do it. And in many science fiction novels, it's as obvious as can be what era it came from. But on the other hand, through the other lens, you really are trying to say in the future, this could happen. So it's subjunctive. It's not prophecy. It's not saying this will happen, but it does share a quality with prophecy in saying that this is not only could happen, but it's so likely to happen that I'm going to write it down in huge detail and make you live in that world for a week or a month until you feel like you've been there and visited it some moment in the future. And one thing that makes science fiction distinctive as a genre is that future world that you're reading about will incorporate inside itself as a novel, as a kind of game to play with its readers, a history that runs back to our present, that explains how it happened. So it's a metaphor for the present. It's a kind of a prophecy. These are two different things. And when they are matched together into one text or one movie, but I really am a text guy, I have to admit, then what you get that is similar to the 3D movie effect, what pops as an artificial third dimension is actually the fourth dimension, which is time. You get a sense of history. You're looking down deep time. Maybe it's the wrong end of the telescope you're looking down, but you're seeing your feeling time as you read the text, not just that future moment, but also your present moment seen as a metaphor, and the fictional history that gets you from your present into that future science fiction story. Now, you can see by how long it's taken me to describe it that this is a complicated aesthetic.
Yeah.
It's a genre that plays a formal game that is relatively complicated, and science fiction readers, they've read a lot of it, and they've seen a lot of and lived in a lot of different futures. First, they understand the formal rules. They're playing the game. They're enjoying it as such in ways that newcomers to science fiction, they think it's just prophecy or they think it's just nonsense. And there are a lot of people. I mean, if I had a dime for every person that said to me, I don't read science fiction, and then, of course, they read Margaret Atwood or they this or that, I would be rich. And they are missing out on one of the great art experiences of our time, which is the reading of science fiction.
Going back to that guy, I'm sorry, I forgot his name, the guy who wrote the science fiction encyclopedia, who said he could judge when a sci-fi story was from.
It's John Clute who wrote the science fiction encyclopedia. That's online. If you just Google and go to science fiction encyclopedia, you'll see what I mean. It is truly almost unbelievably large and magnificent achievement, and it's fun to read because you can look up all the people and also all the tropes, the historical developments, the technologies, everything having to do with science fiction is in this one internet source.
I mean, you've been writing science fiction for a long time. How have your views about both the art form and the kinds of futures it depicts changed over that time?
Ooh, that's a good question. I didn't read science fiction as a child or a youth, and I was a mad reader, but I didn't know science fiction existed even because in my libraries, it was exiled to the back of the store, and it had rocket ships and radar symbols on the spine. The little library symbol that you were reading science fiction at the bottom of the spine was kind of like, this is radioactive, which is very funny. I quite love that. But it was when I right at the end, as I was leaving for college, I grew up in Orange County, California. I was going down to UC San Diego, and I finished off my library's main literary fiction section. At the end, there was science fiction, so I grabbed Asimov, thinking I'll just pick anybody. This anonymous guy. There was only a couple books by him, which says more about my library than about him. But I wrote about it and I said, this is magnificent because I was a mystery story reader. I read detective, especially locked room mysteries. And Asimov was an excellent detective story writer, and although he often put them in science fiction settings. Fine. I was blown away, and I thought, immediately he must be the exception that proves the rule. He's great. The rest of it must be crap by comparison. And so I won't bother. And I started reading nothing but Asimov. So then accidentally, I picked up a paperback by Clifford Simak called The Goblin Reservation. And I read The Goblin Reservation, and it was hilarious. It's a comedy and very science fictional. And I thought, oh, my God, they're all geniuses. So these were two errors in a row that I made, being young and brash. And so I began to read widely in science fiction when I was about 18. And then my college career was a double career, a double major in, history and literature, but then literature was ordinary literary history and criticism plus science fiction, which I did on my own, of course. This is the early 70s. So then I went to the Clarion Science Fiction Writers Workshop, having written through my youth, and it was always bad. And then one Christmas, over holiday, I wrote a science fiction story, and it wasn't bad. It wasn't great, but it wasn't bad. And I was startled because I always seemed to have had a good sense of judgment in that I dismissed my earlier attempts as hopelessly bad, and that writing fiction was harder than I thought it would have been. But this one science fiction story, which is now the first chapter of my novel, The Memory of Whiteness, it got me into Clarion. Damon Knight, the beautiful editor and teacher who founded Clarion with his wife, Kate Wilhelm, he bought that story for his Orbit anthology, and I was off and running. So I started young for someone who didn't run into science fiction until I was 18. And I emphasize this because many a science fiction reader and writer ran into it when they were 8, and it's been the love of their life their whole working life. Like this phrase, the golden age of science fiction is 12. That speaks to the fan experience, that whatever you were reading, whenever you ran into science fiction at age 12, that would be the golden age. Well, for me, not. And yet, when I did run into science fiction, it was the new wave.
Yeah.
So science fiction from about 1965 to 1975 was simply explosive. New wave was really the 60s as expressed in science fiction. And the 60s was a kind of a science fictional decade. In many, many ways, technology and history were accelerating wildly with the great end of the anti-colonial revolutions, and the world, it seemed to be changing so fast that you couldn't really predict the future. So the new wave was very clearly about the present. That's how I fell into it. And my feeling was it's an art form. It's the best way of describing the United States of America and the modern world that currently exists in literature. All the rest of it was old hat, dusty, essentially formally fixed in the 1920s with the great modernists, and just repeating itself ever since, and in many ways quite boring. So bestsellers and the Pulitzer Prize winners of the 1960s, nobody really reads them anymore to a certain extent. They've dropped out because they are attempting to imitate Joyce and Proust and Woolf, and they're bad imitations compared to the originals. So science fiction was the avant-garde. This was my feeling about it. Now, since then, first of all, 50 years has passed, or 40 for sure. And secondly, science fiction itself has gone through several, like every decade, being slightly different, being more mainstreamed, more commercialized, less adventuresome, and also completely overtaken and then overwhelmed by fantasy. My initial experience of science fiction as an avant-garde that was somewhat marginalized but intensely exciting has, of course, changed with the times. It's become a niche in the larger world of fantastica, as John Clute calls it, which is to say speculative fiction, some people call it, the larger realm of fantasy, horror, romantasy, all of the subgenres that exist now. Science fiction proper is just one subset amongst all the rest. It might be the oldest, but that just makes it some kind of doddering grandparent. Science fiction, because the world is now a science fiction novel written by all of us together, and this I've been saying for about 20 years, that we are caught in a science fiction novel that we're all writing together. That's the best explanation of how things feel now. Well, that may be true, but that means that writing actual new science fiction has become particularly hard. It's a form of realism. You could write about what's happening right now in, what are we in, March of 2026, and it would read like a science fiction novel of the 1960s because things have gotten so crazy and technological. That's a different feeling. So I'll quit with that because I've gone on long enough on this, but you see what I'm saying? The genre has shifted under me as the world has shifted over me.
I mean, okay, so the world feels like a science fiction novel now. There are people with outsized power in this world right now who want it to be a science fiction novel, right? Elon Musk has said that science fiction shouldn't remain fiction forever. I don't think he's ever going to hear this podcast, but what would you say to that?
Well, some people read science fiction very badly, or they read a certain strand of science fiction, the kind of American imperialist, positivist, everything's going to be all right as long as we have more technology, etc. There's a lot of ways to read it and write it. And I used to defend Elon Musk as having founded a excellent rocket company and a good car company, and also a person that has declared publicly that he's on the spectrum and has mood swings. And I thought it was pretty brave of him to talk about that. And he's one of our high functioning autistic people that I am inclined to love. So his turn to the dark side with this shift into megalomania, that's always possible when you're both unusual and then very successful. And it's a sad case. But let's just say there were many, many more, and you've written
Yeah.
about them. People like him who are not so famous nor have turned so dark under various pressures and et cetera, that it's worth talking about. Science fiction never stayed science fiction only. It was always shaping the future. People's sense of what was possible then shaped what they did. And you even have things like the development of the submarine and the various kinds of Jules Verne developments, you might say. A whole strand of those going down to people trying to still make up the Star Trek instant medical box and so on and so forth. The things that seemed possible that were presented first as science fiction is working, and then it turned out that they were actually possible. Now, there were other parts of science fiction that looked impossible when they were written, but they were presented as coming in the future that are never going to come. We're never going faster than light. We're never going to do time travel. These are fantasy elements that were injected into science fiction from the start. And one of the interesting cases, and here you have to come back to Musk, is particularly because I've written about it myself, can we inhabit Mars? And in the early 90s, it looked like we could. And my Mars trilogy comes from the early 90s. Since then, we've landed a lot of rovers and done a lot more exploration. We found out that the surface of Mars is intensely poisonous. The perchlorates are there in the parts per hundred in the soil of Mars. And it's poisonous to us in the parts per million range. So the surface of Mars is way more poisonous than I thought when I wrote my book, and also the cosmic radiation, the various factors that make Mars very uninhabitable for humans right now, such that you could go there and you could set up a station underground and protect it from the cosmic rays, and you could go out on the surface and you'd be like smoking a pack of cigarettes a day in terms of the damage to your body. But it wouldn't immediately kill you if you were heavily protected from it and didn't have an accident. And then you could come back home. So in other words, Mars could become a scientific station like Antarctica, because nobody lives in Antarctica year round. You go down there, you come back. Mars could be like that. But as for going there and it being the salvation of humanity and all that crap, that's a fantasy. And if you pay any attention at all, you can sort out what's possible from what's not when it comes to Mars. Is that true for the rest of these possible future innovations? Well, to a certain extent, it is. When I say we're not going to go faster than light and we're not going to have time travel, which the two kind of cross each other, there is quantum entanglement. And so this universe is having non-locality. There are things that are happening in two places at once simultaneously, as far as we can tell. So the universe is mysterious, but can we make a technology that will actually move our physical or mental selves within that mysterious quantum non-locality? Well, I mean, I highly doubt it. But if you want to write that story, then you should write that story for the fun of it.
Sure.
The must trap is to pick one science fiction story, read it simplistically, and then take it as a blueprint for plans in the present. If you were going to do that, which many people do, and it's not his mistake alone, it's a category error that many people make. The thing to do would take the story of us, the utopian story of us solving climate change and making a decent society where there's equality and sufficiency for all. That's the story the science fiction story that you get caught up in and say, oh, we got to make that one real. That would be the sensible move to make.
Okay, before I move on, I can't resist. Quantum entanglement is one of the main subjects of my first book, actually, What is Real. It's a fascinating phenomenon and, incredibly fertile for science fiction stories, but you can prove that you can't use it for communication, much less transportation. Going back to that optimistic science fiction story, I mean, you wrote a version of that in The Ministry for the Future. It's a fascinating book because on the one hand, it opens with one of the most and I mean this as praise. I hope you take it as praise. It opens with one of the most brutal scenes that I've ever seen in literature, and yet it ends up being a very optimistic book.
Yes.
Why did you make that choice?
Well, I had been writing utopian fiction not throughout my career, but since for sure the late 80s with Pacific Edge. And I kept coming back to it time after time, but they were often displaced or partial pocket utopias or utopias set on Mars or Antarctica or in an alternative history where things changed back like in the 1400s, always somewhere else and not in our immediate future. And I thought, okay, now's the time. For one thing, we're in a terrible fix with climate change and the mass extinction event that that's causing, and our footprint in general on the planet being catastrophic for the other life forms that we rely upon for our own health. So a bad fix. So now at this point, a utopian novel is to say we get through the 21st century without a mass extinction event. That's a utopian story now because we're in such a dangerous position. So I decided to do that, and I wanted to emphasize the danger. I had read an article about wet bulb 35 temperatures, so essentially a heat index that combines heat and humidity. And when you have very high heat and very high humidity in combination, which is going to happen more and more,
Yeah.
then that becomes fatal for human beings who aren't protected by air conditioning. And of course, the air conditioning usually relies on electricity. So if the grid goes down in one of these events, people are in danger of dying
Yeah.
en masse. That's true, and that is a rather terrifying possibility for us all right now. And I wanted us to contemplate that as a worst case scenario, and then from that build a 30-year history starting from right now that was a best case scenario. So not all problems are solved at the end of Ministry for the Future, not even close. But there had been a bending of the curve back towards biosphere health. And I wanted it to seem realistic, like every single point along the way, the events that happened, which included a lot of violence, chaos, disorder. There is no plan that gets people there. It's a whole lot of people doing the best they can, following various lines of planning that don't always cohere. That nevertheless we could get to a good place, which I think people very much appreciated. The book has been important to a whole lot of people who have then oriented their careers, et cetera, and their mindsets to the story that Ministry for the Future tells. So, I mean, it came out in 2020. We've had a bizarre and catastrophic 5 years since it came out. And yet the book still fits because it portrays a bizarre and chaotic history. And yet the good outcome still exists both in the book and in our real world right now. The good outcomes still exist as a possibility. We would have to do some different things than we're doing in March of 2026, but there were many really good projects underway and going full steam right now. So despite the surface chop of ridiculousness, from our U.S. administration, underneath the surface chop, the tide in some ways is going quite well. And that's hard to keep in mind in the current news cycle, the 5-minute news cycle. It's not as reported on as it should be, but it's not over, and we're not doomed at this point. We could indeed make a decent society still. So while that is still the case, then Ministry for the Future still looks pretty accurate, pretty good, pretty helpful.
What are some of those developments that are keeping you hopeful about the direction we're heading in?
There's a couple that are obvious, and everybody knows about these. First, the clean energy transition, that clean renewable energy is cheaper to install now than trying to create more fossil fuel opportunities. And this is a massive civilizational, technological transition. It's going to take a while. And of course, there's fossil fuel advocates, including our president, that are fighting it tooth and nail. But the economics of it are such that, and also the physics of it, the climate change physics of it, are such that the clean energy transition is something to hang your hat on and say, look, good things are happening at a level where you don't have to be a saint. You don't have to pay a green premium. You can do the cheapest thing, and it turns out to be the best thing. Well, this is new. This wasn't true even 10 years ago. Now it's true. And it's going to go faster as people need more energy for adequate lives, and also need to not torch the planet that is feeding them. So the combined needs are such that clean energy will go like gangbusters from now on, and even faster as soon as we get idiots out of control in the soap opera in the
Yeah.
States. The other thing is biosphere protection. In Ministry for the Future, I talk about E.O. Wilson's Half Earth. He was a great scientist and a great public intellectual, like Ben Franklin or William James. E.O. Wilson will be remembered like that. And his Half Earth plan, when I read it, which is maybe only 15 or 20 years ago that it came out, I laughed. I thought, this is the most utopian science fiction story I've ever heard. And now we've got 30 by 30 plans and treaties all over this earth, including the oceans. The COP that the Chinese ran in Montreal right after the pandemic declared 30 by 30 that every country should protect 30% of their land surface from human interference by the year 2030. And many people in that movement talk about 50 by 50. And then the International Maritime Organization declared the same thing for the oceans, that 30% of the ocean should be left entirely alone and essentially not fished. And of course, we're heating it, we're polluting it, but to not fish it would be tremendous for the life in the oceans. And again, these are underreported and not fully understood to be gigantic improvements in our relationship to the planet. Now, admittedly, like all of the stuff at the COPs and in international treaties, these are promises only, and promises that get broken all the time. So promises can be broken, but promises are indicative of a kind of what you might call common sense or the general intellect of what people internationally in all countries agree is what we ought to be doing. So even making a statement that we ought to be doing something in such formal terms as an international agreement is significant. And then promise breaking, nobody likes that. It looks bad. It's obvious that you're doing the wrong thing when you break these promises.
It makes it easier to report on it if there's a promise made and then broken. You can say they're not doing this thing that they said they were going to do, as opposed to they're not doing this thing that they should do. Unfortunately, we still live in capitalism, and that means we need to talk about our partners and sponsors. But fortunately, our partners and sponsors are great. And if you want to support Dreaming Against the Machine directly, you can join us on Patreon, where $5 a month gives you the chance to ask questions of upcoming guests and a dedicated stream of cat pictures. We love our patrons, and we also love being a part of the Multitude Collective at multitudeshows.com. Multitude is a podcast company made up of passionate people creating shows you can count on. Shows like Simple and Clean. Simple and Clean is a show where hosts Misha Stenton and Mayana Barron and friends talk about Kingdom Hearts, a little video game franchise about really big feelings. Join them as they discuss the plot, characters, world building, music, fashion, fan base, and societal impact of a thing that, by all means, probably shouldn't even exist. Never heard of Kingdom Hearts? That's okay. They're here to break it down for you, explain why they love it, and hopefully to convince you that this weird little story deserves a place in your heart. Each week, they attempt to unravel how this deceptively expansive game series has touched an entire generation of deeply earnest weirdos. And along the way, realize that what they're talking about might not be just a video game, but a whole lot more. New episodes every Sunday, wherever you listen to your podcasts. And here's a word from our sponsors. One of this week's sponsors is Shaker and Spoon, a monthly cocktail and mocktail subscription. Full disclosure, they sent me a free box this month, and I'm excited to try it on a night off soon. Each box includes 3 original recipes from award-winning bartenders, with enough ingredients to make 4 of each of those drinks for at least 12 drinks in total. And each box includes everything you need to make the drink except for the alcohol, and they're built around 1 spirit per box, so you really just need 1 bottle of something that you probably already have on hand if you drink. And if you don't drink, every box includes 0 proof options for every recipe, and some of the drinks are designed to be completely spirit-free from the start. The boxes come with recipe cards that include guidance on mixing techniques and glossary of terms that teach you how to shake, stir, build, and garnish these unusual cocktails with eclectic ingredients. And they also include everything else that you need to try out these drinks, like custom syrups, bitters, extracts, garnishes, and aromatics. And so you can try the drinks without going off and buying full bottles of niche ingredients that you'll never use again. It's a great idea for date nights or hosting a party or bringing a gift to someone else's party. And you can always skip or swap boxes or even just buy individual kits or ingredients without subscribing. So you can try this stuff out at their website, shakerandspoon.com. I mean, this is a big question and maybe an unfair question, but do you think we're going to make it through the 21st century without a mass extinction event?
Oh, well, this is the impossible. And so this is where, as a science fiction writer, I have to clarify the game, but also as a science fiction writer, and I want to add
Yeah.
to that nobody can do this. So in other words, if somebody has on their business card futurologist or
Yeah.
futurist, they might as well be putting scam artist in red letters on their forehead
Yeah.
because everybody's a futurist of equal standing and ability. All well-educated humans are excellent futurists, and all humans are always thinking about their
Yeah.
futures and analyzing as best as can be done. To go on from that, speaking strictly as a novelist who sets stories in the future, it's obvious to everybody what I'm going to say. From this moment, we can go into a mass extinction event that will hammer human civilization drastically badly, or we can move into a rather prosperous future where all the living creatures on the planet are doing well. And so this is what's disorienting. It's almost a 180, right? So you're standing looking towards the east, and the east is the future. Well, all the way off to the north is catastrophe, all the way off to the south. It's like a 180-degree spread that is possible from where we are right now. So how do you call it? What kind of trajectories are there? And you can begin to look at human population. You can begin to look at the populations of all the other big mammals and all of the other species on the planet. How are they doing? What kind of trajectory are they on? Are there less than there were before? Are there more? And you can create almost like weather predictions. You can create definitive tracks that come right up to the present moment. Where are they going from there? This is where it gets tricky. First of all, none of these are linear progressions where you can just draw a straight line extrapolation, as it's called. They're all going to have logistical curves of one kind or another, supply and demand changes and fluctuations. So they're all curving off into different ways. And then they're all interfering with each other in ways that are either obvious or unobvious, to the point where the future, especially right now, the human's future and the Earth's future are indeterminate. We have some trajectories towards mass extinction event. They seem to be lessening, partly because of us paying attention and taking care of the wild animals and trying to stop extinctions, especially of the species that we like or know about. And that's a general trend that has to do with land use and what we do with habitat in general and how it changes in agriculture. All these things combine together such that you can imagine success of the year 2100 of us having done quite well, and the 2020s just being like the previous 20s in the 1920s, a time of incredible instability and chaos because certain fundamental issues haven't been resolved. And so we could either trend into a kind of a catastrophic World War II and aftermath, but history doesn't repeat like that. Ours will be a different kind of catastrophe set if we don't cope with the things that are happening. But if we do, the powers that we have gathered in material sciences and in our understanding in general of how the world works, that's knowledge we could put to use. And then also the drive towards equality. There's a general sense in the world that everybody's equally valuable. Every single human is equally valuable. So there's 8 billion of us that should be at a rough equality with all the other 8 billion. It's not true now. Financial and physical inequality amongst humans is extreme. And so solving that is one problem to solve. And it would be really good for the biosphere if we didn't have such insane human inequality as well.
Yeah.
So all these things combined, that's all you've got is a big mass that you cannot make predictions out of.
Oh, but still, there are a lot of people out there. I mean, I go around giving talks about my book, my new book. One of the most common responses I get from people is despair. They're like, I'll talk with them about these terrible ideas that tech billionaires have about the future and what the future should be, and like why they're taking sort of the wrong kind of inspiration from science fiction and reading science fiction very badly, and especially last year, and maybe this is itself a sort of sign of optimism. Last year in particular, when I was doing this, I got a lot of people saying, okay, but what can we do? It's hopeless. They won. I will say lately, there's been less of that. People are feeling a little bit more hopeful now than they did a year ago. And I think I can understand that with the shock of the 2024 election a little bit farther behind us and some more hopeful things that have happened since then, along with some horrible things. But I know a lot of people who are going to be very surprised and pleased to hear that you think we're not doomed.
Well, yeah, but this is a good chance to talk about your book, which I loved,
Thank you.
the new one about and this is about people misreading
Yeah.
science fiction, of being bad science fiction readers, but also bad science fiction writers of their own lives.
Mm.
And there is a lot of bad science fiction out there where it's often a replay of older stories of essentially there will be teenage gun fantasies, which was a nickname in the publishing industry for a long-running series called There Will Be War. The science fiction has in it a strand of both doomerism, but also of fascist solutions. So there's definitely right-wing science fiction,
Oh yeah.
and even the almost oxymoron of the right-wing utopia. If only soldiers ran the country, if only a junta would take over the
Yeah.
United States, and then everybody had to be in the military before they could actually vote. This is Heinlein's
Yeah, I was about to
Starship
say
Troopers.
Heinlein was all about this. Yeah.
Yes, yes, this is his vision, and it's a silly
Yeah.
vision in some ways, but on the other hand, national service that everybody should put in a year of working for their nation between high school and college. This is not uncommon on this planet,
Yeah.
and several countries in the EU have plans that are somewhat like that. It might be a good a mixer where everybody in the country gets to know each other. This is sort of like the draft, but for everybody. It's not a terrible notion if it's transformed into good works and emergency rescue. But then also the question of inequality, that there's the great man theory
Oh
of
yeah.
history, and it usually is men. So the bad science fiction's there, and then the bad readings of it is there. Like, let's make this a blueprint, because the science fiction community had a phrase, fans are slans. And this refers to a novel Slan by A.E. Van Vogt, where an ordinary guy turned out to be a salvationary figure from a different universe or whatever, who was going to save humanity by doing great things, but always under the radar and always pursued by the authorities, so that he had to be a rebel without a cause, except it was a cause because he was a Slan. And then fans, science fiction fans, outcasts from ordinary society, geeks, nerds, before nerddom had become popular and conquered the
Yeah.
world in terms of Silicon Valley and tech. Well, this was a feeling of being an oppressed minority. It was entirely cultural, but often these were misfits who couldn't get along in their ordinary society. They would go to a science fiction convention, and all of their friends were there, and everybody there was like them. And the science fiction community was very intensely loyal to itself and enjoying itself. And anytime a science fiction writer wrote a story like Slan, and one could bring up an example from the 80s like
Yep.
Ender's Game. There's another example from more recently that I'm not even going to mention. These are immensely popular
Oh
amongst
yeah.
fans because fans
Yeah,
are
I grew up reading Ender's Game.
well, there you go. So if a novel tells you, although you are despised at your local junior high school, are actually a secret master of
Yep.
the universe, and if you're Jesus, try not to turn into Hitler along the way, and this becomes fascinating because it reinforces this sense that even though you are an outcast in your own little town, you are a hero on the galactic stage.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of bad science fiction, and in essence, these are power
Yeah.
fantasies. And they're power fantasies that appeal in particular to young men, and now in our current society, more and more, also to young women who are just coming into their adulthoods wondering, well, what kind of person am I and how can I exert myself? How can I be a full person? And you can dodge into a science fiction universe, and your book describes this very, very well, and imagine yourself to be one of these secret heroes, and it helps you psychologically, unless it deceives
Yeah.
you in certain fundamental ways, which it can.
Ender's Game is such an interesting choice because I know so many people my age who read it as a kid and loved it, and I've gone back and looked at it, and it's really pretty awful in terms of like the message that it's sending. And I feel like I hope I escaped that, relatively unscathed. But yeah, I mean, these tech billionaires, I mean, the current crop of tech billionaires, I think, are a bit too old to have grown up reading Ender's Game, but with the possible exception of someone like Sam Altman. But it's the kind of story that I think really appeals to them even now.
Yes.
This great man theory that you're persecuted. I mean, you take a look at Mark Andreessen and that unhinged techno-optimist manifesto of his, and it's dripping with resentment. He's trying to set himself up as, like I say in my book, he's trying to set himself up as like a David against the Goliath of the world when he is, by any reasonable measure, a Goliath.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple things to
Yeah.
say there. Ender's Game was popular with young people right up to the moment that the movie of it came out, which kind of popped its balloon by showing how
Yeah.
absurd it was. And at that point, that book's influence was dead. A movie can kill a book, and it often has happened. And that's what happened with Ender's Game. But it was at least 20
Yeah.
years and maybe a little more of
Yeah,
influence
absolutely.
that it had over teenage minds. And then the other thing to say, though, is let's not make too much of a type or a stereotype out of tech
Sure.
billionaires, because on the one hand, being a billionaire is a curse that changes you because you have too much money, and it's what I call the Midas touch. Everything you touch turns to gold, and you can't trust that people are being real with you. Do they like me? Are they pretending that they
Mhm.
like me because I have so much
Exactly.
money? Are they even giving me the time of day because everybody gives the time of day to a billionaire?
Yeah.
One time I accidentally insulted a billionaire in their own space and told them to shut up when I didn't know who they were. And afterwards, everybody was looking at me like, Stan, you didn't, you were real mean to Mr. X there. And I said, who's Mr. X? And they all fell on the floor laughing because they knew, and I knew later, that if I had known who he was, I would have been more polite.
Sure.
That happens. And so they can't trust anybody
Yeah.
really, and they have to find their friends. So they're isolated, and isolation is maddening.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is they're under enormous pressure towards a bad result, but some of them have resisted it. Some of them have a sense of judgment such that they realize they became billionaires somewhat by accident, by luck, by the current laws, by making up something that everybody wanted at
Yeah.
the right time in the
Yeah.
right place with the right backers. And they realize that, and they don't think of themselves as geniuses, but simply as lucky people. So now you have to make differentiations. This group, rather small, almost entirely male, under stupendous psychological pressure, many of them are going to crack and go megalomaniac and believe they're geniuses, and that's why they're rich. A lot of them are going to say, well, this is stupid, and I'm going to have to work hard to live a good life and stay normal and have people I trust. And they still have good judgment enough to withhold the incredible pressure of having too much money. Now, as for the doomerism thing that you started with, that you got and talked to people, well, it's time to stiffen your spine a little bit in this sense. It's not over till it's over, and it's never going to be
Yeah.
over. So doomerism is simply a cynicism. It's a giving upness. It's a weakness of character. You got to have courage. You got to have courage even when the shells are falling around you. Otherwise, it's useless. And you got to realize we're in a wicked political fight that's going to last us for the rest of our lives, for even the youngest of your listeners. The rest of their lives are going to be in this wicked political fight. And so that's not a time to give up. And this is what doomerism is. Oh, I give up. We're doomed already. But the scientists will tell us that in biosphere terms, we're not yet doomed to a runaway greenhouse effect. We're not doomed to apocalypse ever. It's a case of better or worse. But we're not yet over the edge on these various tipping points that means that there's nothing we can do now. We're close. We're all too close. But as far as the scientists studying this very issue can tell, we still have, what would you say, a couple decades to try to pull ourselves together on the biospheric front. And then on the human front, it's always available to pass legislation that simply taxes billionaires out of existence. And this is something that I wonder if you run, because you talk to these tech people probably more than I do. You should always have a workshop moment. What's the minimum amount of money that you would need to have to make you feel like you're okay financially? And that would include the social security of your kids, presumably, if you have kids. What's the minimum? And here's what I've found. Many a billionaire will refuse to play that game.
Yeah.
That it's too spooky. And they say, well, I mean, I've got billions and I'm making such good use of them, better use than the government would make of them. So why shouldn't I be a billionaire? Because I'm a philanthropist. And that's an obvious answer. And so you have to press hard. Okay, but put that aside. What if you're not trying to be a philanthropist and be an individual government at the same time, which is, of course, a bad fate in several different ways? What if it was just you and your family? How much would you need? So sometimes down in Silicon Valley, I've gotten the room to lighten up, you might say, to the point of playing the game. And I'm going to say that a figure that often gets landed on is $10 million. Okay, you got your 10 million. What is lacking? Well, nothing.
Yeah.
You've got a house, you've got a life, you're never going to run out of money, and your kids aren't going to run out of money, and your interest is making more money than you actually spend in a year if you didn't want to splurge, etc. 10 million. Well, okay, then $1 billion is 100 times that. So you've got 100 times more than you need. Well, that's a big ratio.
Yeah.
If you've got 100 times more than you need to feel good and secure, then now you're in a world of hurt, because now you're insecure again. You need guards, you need bodyguards, you need tax lawyers, your kids are crazy, etc. These are bad fates that come from having too much. Well, what if there were progressive taxes that taxed assets as well as incomes, that were progressive in the true sense, like after World War II? These are legislative programs. This is not revolution. This is just a working political majority that believed in this kind of action.
I mean, this is echoing the end of my book where I quote you talking about this, and I go on about this at length. I couldn't agree more. And I think that, not only are the billionaires harmed by having their wealth in the way that you're talking about, this sort of Midas touch issue, but I also think that history makes it clear that this can't go on, and that ultimately this is going to end in one of two ways: that either we find a way to build a more equitable and just society peacefully by redistributing the wealth and taxing billionaires out of existence, or eventually they get dragged out of their homes. And in that sense, taxation is the compromise, and it's always striking to me when billionaires don't themselves advocate for it, because there are some billionaires who say, no, you should tax me more, like Warren Buffett.
Yeah, and I think it's more generally known. One thing about our mediated world is that the media focuses on those billionaires who want to talk and be celebrities. And I'm going to say that the billionaires that want to also be celebrities are a minority, and you can almost name them. They're almost all guys, not all of them, but say 90% of them.
Yeah.
And this is a dysfunction, a sign of a personality gone awry, to actually want to be a celebrity as well as exceedingly rich. Well, money you can give away, you can do things with and that are positive. You can become a philanthropy and a small government of goodness, and many of them do. But a celebrity you can't give away and you can't dodge, and it's a curse in and of itself. And anybody who's gotten there should know that. So wanting to get there is a teenage fantasy gone awry. So one way to talk about this, though, that is more structural than psychological, because, these poor guys, they've got their billions, they're miserable. Oh dear. It's hard to feel that
Yes.
sorry for them because they pretend not to be miserable, or they have what look like luxurious lives, but luxury's not good for you. So we talk about the wage ratio. There should be a minimum. Essentially, this is floor and ceiling talk. There should be a floor where nobody is miserable on this planet. And right now, about 1 out of every 5 people is immiserated. And so clearly society sucks. That the way our civilization is a moral catastrophe, because we could take care of and make sure to educate and give and make sure that everybody has a floor of adequacy. So we'll call that 1. And then what multiple of 1 is the max where you create a ceiling that you can't go above? Well, I talked about this in Ministry for the Future using the example of the U.S. Navy, a highly regarded organization with pretty good esprit de corps from top to bottom, and pretty high functioning in that they've had a nuclear program now for 70 years without any kind of truly severe accident. They've lost a bomb or two, but they haven't had any of their nuclear plants blow up on them, which would be good because they're inside submarines, et cetera.
Yeah.
U.S. Navy, the wage ratio, the able seaman gets $25,000 a year plus room and board and education. These are big pluses, and insurance and all the other costs. So they pretty much can bank that $25,000 a year. It sounds really small, right, in this world?
Yeah.
But they can bank that and get the rest of stuff so that when they're out of the Navy, they've got a bit of a bank account, a savings account, and an education and a job skills. The admiral, the highest salary you can get in the U.S. Navy is $200,000 a year. So this is a 1 to 8 wage ratio. And so if adequacy in ordinary life were to be defined as the real costs that are being covered by the Navy that the able seaman doesn't have to pay when they're young, say it's something like $100,000, then 8 times that would be $800,000 a year. So the fact that our wage ratio in America is like 1 to 1,500 between the minimum wage and the CEO wage average, it shows that we're living in a kind of insanity.
Yeah.
A stupid culture. It's not just insane, but it's also kind of stupid. And the fact that everybody accepts this, oh, that's just reality. Oh, you can't change that. When you could get a working political majority in the political system and simply legislate that into being, you'd have to, of course, encounter quite a bit of political opposition to it, because a certain number of billionaires would pay heavily and lobby heavily to make sure those laws don't become law. And that includes the campaigning process. So you have to look at politicians that are essentially bought. Could you elect more unbought politicians than bought politicians? Well, this is the political question of our time.
But the good news is there's more of us than there are of them.
But a lot of us, we have the hegemony, we have common sense, we have what everybody believes to be true, the story that we believe in as being, quote, realistic. And this term of Mark Fisher's, capitalist realism, or what Margaret Thatcher said, there is no alternative. This story's in our heads like an earworm in your ear. And it's hard to break the power of that story.
Well, trying to break the power of that story is what we're trying to do here on Dreaming Against the Machine. And so I think that that's as good a place to leave it as we could have. So Stan, thank you again for coming on.
My pleasure, Adam. And thank you for your book. It's something that Wells quoted out of Chaucer. Go, little book. Go to England and France and China and this place and that place, like it had wheels or feet. Go, little book. And that'll help the story.
Thank you. I hope you're right. And I hope we talk again soon.
Right-ho.
Thanks again to this week's guest, Kim Stanley Robinson. Next week, I'll be talking with Dave Karp about some really bad books and how we can maybe do better than they do, thinking about what a good future might look like. To submit questions for future guests and to suggest other guests and to see more pictures of Babka, join the conversation on Patreon. You can also find us on YouTube, on Instagram at DATMPod, on the web and on Blue Sky at dreamingagainstthemachine.com, or just find us wherever you get your podcasts. Dreaming Against the Machine is a proud member of Multitude Productions. Our executive producer is Nick Carissimi. Our associate producer is Rosie Thomas. Our theme music is by Jared Emerson Johnson. Our show logo is by Nick James. And our fearless leader is Bobka, the greatest cat in the observable universe. I'm Adam Becker, and I'll see you next week.